As Marty explained in his excellent presentation about treaty rights, one of the conditions of the treaties was to provide agricultural assistance. And the quote that you see here on the screen is a direct result of the treaty rights and the first agricultural team to come out to do an assessment of agriculture, the possibilities for agriculture on the Menominee Reservation. And as you can see, their assessment was really quite bleak. This is a terrible area for agriculture. The climate, the growing seasons are short, they're very, very fickle, the soils are terrible, the forests are thick, it's almost impossible to clear them. And the overall prospects for the Menominee were really quite, well, they were judged to be minimal at best, right? I think that for a couple of the signatories of the treaties themselves, the assessment of the agricultural experts that came out would have come as quite a surprise. Both Kanippeway and Kilmonican had actually, their bands had extensive agricultural fields right in this area that basically the treaty negotiators said had very little opportunity for agriculture whatsoever. As it turns out, Menominee peoples are the original sustainable and organic agriculturalists in Wisconsin. As it turns out, they were able to practice agriculture at a very extensive scale through market periods of climate change. We've documented almost 1,000 years of continuous field systems, and what I'm going to do is give you a tour of those field systems and some of the agricultural practices we've been able to infer from the soils themselves. This is a 19th century map of the vegetation on the Menominee, on what is today the Menominee Reservation. It's a cathedral of a forest, and part of the reason we've been able to find some of the things that we've been able to find is because of the way that Menominee peoples have been practicing forestry. There's large segments of the ground that are actually intact here, even though this has been in continuous forestry production basically since the mid-19th century. And we're going to take a look at 4 sites along the Wolf River here, starting with Shepashticum, and then moving to the Joe Dick Road site, coming down to the Big Eddy West site, and then finally to the Waykay Creek site. So the forests here are very diverse, and I want to simply point out that these are not virgin forests, that the actual composition, the biodiversity of the forest, this is because of Menominee forest practices, right? Forests here, the trees were planted, they were tended, they were selectively felled over the course of many, many generations. So the idea that there was virgin forest, that's not really correct. The forest is an artifact just as much as the agricultural field is. It's part of a cultural landscape. And it's really interesting, this alternation between forest and agriculture, as we'll see a little bit. So this is just a portion of the Shepashticum site. We're going to take a look at some excavations that we did right here. So this is the Wolf River. These fields stretch for over 1 kilometer along the Wolf River floodplain. That's a good-sized agricultural field for today. The settlement pattern is really quite interesting. In the higher portions of the Wolf River Valley, you have a series of mounds. You have storage pit precincts, and we get scattered house basins all the way across. There's no village. People are living 3-4 houses. Then you're getting mounds, you're getting storage pit precincts, you're getting agricultural fields, then you get 3 or 4 more houses and so forth. And so this complex just spreads over really quite large areas. Again, I'm a soils person, so forgive me for this for just a little bit. We can see the fields on the ground because Menominee, as well as ancestral Ho-Chunk and other peoples, they would elevate the planting surface above the natural level of the ground to build what we call a raised bed or a raised field today. There's different construction sequences, different ways of building a field, and the way the fields are laid out, the way they're built is intimately related to the local environment in a way that improves cultivating conditions. So in this particular slide here, you're looking at a portion of the original surface of the ground. As you can see in this close-up here, the soil is oxidized. The reason it's oxidized is the very first step was after clearing the forest, fire breaks were constructed, branches were spread evenly out across the entire site, and there was a very special kind of burn that happened there. And what that would do is it would put charcoal and ash into this otherwise very sandy and acidic soil, improving its fertility, raising the pH. As we found out when we were interviewing elders, that's a practice that's still done on the reservation today. And what was really nice about that, I can generate lots of numbers, that's what I do, but the stories from the elders gave those numbers meaning. And what was nice for the elders is that what they were taught by their parents, their grandparents, going back 7 generations and much more, has a scientific validity. You want to improve the soil, the way you do that is to improve the pH, is to add certain kinds of nutrients. They knew how to burn the ground in order to do that initial step for improving the soils. So this is the kind of burn that we get at this site. As we see, we have different burns in different areas. It depends on the local environment here. So here's the original surface of the ground. This is how the materials were basically hoed up into the planting surface that's this way. I'll leave the pottery to my compatriot here. You take something as interesting as earth and you make it into pottery. I don't really care about it so much anymore, so I'm a soils person. These are late woodland pots. They date right around 800 AD. That's consistent with the radiocarbon dates that we got from the wood charcoal from this initial burn area. So this is the oldest field system in the mid-continent. It's not the oldest agriculture, but it's the oldest field system that survives in the mid-continent, and they started building here about 800 AD. Now, when we excavate these fields, one of the most complex things for me is I have to look at soil in 2 dimensions, imagine it in 3 dimensions, and then try to make inferences of what native peoples were doing here. And so it could be a very complex process. So we dig in about 5 centimeter levels, about 2 inches, and we stop and we photograph and we map. And I'm very grateful that that's the way we do things. We came down on this here. We were just getting out of a planting surface, and the fields are oriented in this particular fashion. So you're actually looking at this field here, and this is the planting surface. And as we were getting out of that planting surface, we hit this very dark stain. And at that time, I couldn't explain it. I just didn't know what was going on. So you map it, you photograph it, you sample it. Like I said, every 2 inches. This is what we do going down. Once we finished the units, it was one of these chance things. I happened to be getting ready to take a field crew shot, and I was looking up, and I noticed that even though the fields are oriented this way, can you see how we have this undulation here? And then we have another undulation here. These fields were rebuilt. When they were initially built, they were built perpendicular to the Wolf River, and this would have aided in water drainage. The Wolf River basically floods. Later on, the whole site was redone, and they reoriented the fields so the fields were actually parallel with the Wolf River. This would have captured water, this would have captured nutrients, and this would have been used to maintain that agricultural system. We have good paleo-ecological data from that time, and that switch corresponds to a warmer and drier time period. So these are very, very dynamic fields. They're never static, they're constantly changing. This is the Joe Dick site. This is a huge site. This can be measured in square kilometers. I want you to think about agricultural fields today in Wisconsin and Michigan. How many do you see can be measured in square kilometers? Menominee they were hunters, they were gatherers, they were fishers, but you look at a field of this size, they were certainly agriculturalists as well. The Joe Dick site extends from the lowlands to the uplands. We call the lowlands the Joe Dick East site. The uplands we call the Joe Dick West site. As we've continued to do survey through the forest, we now have a Joe Dick South site, a Joe Dick North site. They just keep going and going and going. It's just absolutely absolutely remarkable. So we're down here in the lowlands. There's a very large wetland complex that's right behind here. You're about a foot above that particular wetland complex here. This is just a field map here of what everyone is excavating. This is Dave Overstreet. He and I are co-PIs on this project. This is Jeff Greeno, who's a Menominee forester. I had a lot of very interesting walks through the forest with Jeff Greeno and some other Menominee members. And very, very quickly, because we talked about this yesterday, both in the Menominee language as well as with some of the people I walked through the forest, we make a distinction between wild and domesticated, right? I mean, that's how I was brought up, and that's what I was taught. Menominee peoples don't make that distinction, and that is really important as we're now doing our analyses of what Menominee peoples were growing, because we get a mix of wild and domesticated plants in these fields. And the rotation of the forest is an important part, which with the fields, is an important part of the overall productivity of the system. So I'm very grateful to Jeff and everything that he taught me over the past couple of years. So at the Joe Dick East site, here the planting surfaces are oriented just like so. And we took the units down in section here in order to try and understand how they were built. So here you're looking at the original surface of the ground, and as at Shepashtican, we had a very similar kind of burn in this particular setting. Fire breaks were set up because we don't get evidence of the burning just outside the sites. The burn proceeded in a way that oxidized the sediments. We get lots of fine charcoal, so they're spreading out the branches fairly evenly in order to get a particular kind of burn. And again, the burning is good. The ash will provide some nutrients, calcium, phosphorus, and so on. The charcoal helps with the microbial populations and the soil fertility and provides some carbon. Burning is a way to deal with insects and some other issues, and they knew how to burn in a very kind of beneficial way. You're looking here at the original surface of the ground, and we got a radiocarbon date of right around 1200 AD for when this burning took place. And what I want to point out here are these reddish-colored deposits. This is the underlying soil, and so what that tells us is that the Joe Dick fields were built by not digging deep into the soil, but taking those surface deposits and basically mounding them up, right, in order to elevate the planting surface. Later on, they ditched down really deeply and took those deposits to put into the field. So again, we've got a changing strategy of how the fields are being maintained over time down. So that ditching down is what gives us these big reddish orange deposits, as you can see here. Now, one of the things I was not prepared for was to encounter a soil that didn't have earthworms in it. And I've read about this, but all the soils I've ever seen have earthworms in it. And when you get away from the Wolf River Valley, there's very few earthworms. And this changes the entire nature of the soil itself. Earthworms, when they eat, they go up and down, and they consume that organic matter, and they bring it down into the soil, which is great for agriculture. But it changes the whole soil ecosystem. So soils without earthworms, you have a lot of leaf litter on top, you have lots of fungus, mushrooms. I've seen more mushrooms on the Menominee Reservation than I've ever seen anywhere. Every color of the rainbow, every shape and size. I took about 50 pictures of different kinds of I know nothing about mushrooms. I didn't even know half this stuff existed when I was out there. But this is the change in the soil ecosystem. What's nice for me is that the stratigraphy is left in place, and we find remarkable things because the earthworms haven't disturbed it all up. So in that initial construction surface, we get these small little pieces of pottery. This is not normal everyday pottery. These are very, very small pots. Archaeologists call them pinch pots. And every time there was an initial construction of the fields, we get little pinch pods. I suspect that's part of a groundbreaking ceremony, right, in which a little seed jar maybe or something along those lines so here you can see the is broken as part of the initial preparation of the fields. And so here you can see some of that small little pottery. We actually were able to excavate seeds, charred seeds in place, and that tells us two things: that burning crop stubble was part of maintaining the fields, and then anything that was missed during harvest time, if that gets burned, that gets preserved. So far we have corn, we have squash, we have sunflower, and as I'll talk later on, we actually have the waste, the chaff from wild rice. I'll show that in a later slide. We're still analyzing the materials here, but here's an example of some of the seeds that we were able to pull out from a planting surface. So for sure we have corn, we have squash, we have sunflower. These analyses are still ongoing. I'm hoping we're going to find beans. But beans don't preserve very well in the archaeological record. I'm doing some isotope analyses on the soil because beans leave a very characteristic kind of isotope signature, so we're trying to get at this at multiple ways. Perhaps even most remarkably is we get tool marks in the soil itself. This shape right here is from a scapula hoe, perhaps an elk scapula or a bison scapula hoe. It's in a ditch. And they're pulling up those materials from the ditch to the planting surface in order to keep the soils quite fertile. So the preservation of this is really quite remarkable. This is Joe Dick West, and the fields here, the planting surfaces are oriented this way. This is the highest point on the landscape. I need to make this very, very clear in the subsequent slides. This is the highest point in the landscape. There's no surface that's higher than this particular point, overlooking a tributary of the Wolf River. I don't know if you can, how well this shows up here. You can see this dark layer here. This is an old buried field. So here you can see the planting surface that's going this way. Here you can see a ditch. Here you can see another planting surface that's going this way. Here you can see the slope of a buried field. So let me ask you, how do you bury a field in an upland? One basket load at a time. One basket load at a time. This is a very complex stratigraphy. This is the original surface of the ground. We got a slightly different kind of burn here, but not as different as at the Big Eddy site, but we got a slightly different kind of burn here, different environment, different kind of burn. Materials were then piled up, and we have a buried field that's about here, that's coming across. Then it's truncated by this storage pit. We've mapped about 1,000 storage pits just in this section of the site. Excuse me, we've identified 1,000, we've mapped 300. It takes a long time to map these storage pits. The storage pits are between 1 and 2 meters in diameter and 1 and 2 meters deep. When we do encounter a storage pit that it's spoiled in the past, we find wild rice, we find lots of nuts, we find lots of corn in those storage pits. Most storage pits are empty because they store their products well, but we do occasionally find some that do have. So here's a storage pit here. There's actually 2 storage pits from 2 different time periods. So we get this initial field. So here's part of that field. Here's part of that field. It gets truncated by that storage pit, and then we get all this deposition that buried this initial surface here. The deposits here are different than the deposits here. They're finer, they have more silt and clay. They are not from this area. You have to go down to the lowlands to find soil that's of that particular texture. And they brought that soil up, they buried the entire hill slope that's here, and then they rebuilt the fields that you have here. That was farmed for a little while, and then we had a second set of storage pits that truncated that upper one. So we got that repeating pattern, right? We got planted, the area is used to farm, and then it's used for storage, and then it's used to farm, and then it's used for storage, right? And so we get a little bit of soil development, that's in here. We have very tightly clustered radiocarbon dates, so that whole sequence is happening over about 100 years or so. This is rotational fallow, is what's happening here. You're farming, you're letting the soils rest, you're managing the succession so you're still getting food, then you're farming it again, right? And then you're letting it rest, you're managing the succession so you're getting wild foods, right? This is very sophisticated stuff. If you have a lousy soil that's acidic and nutrient poor, this is what you do, right? It's the burning and it's that rotational fallow. And just so you know, I love showing pictures of soil stratigraphy, so I'm just going to repeat this story for the next few slides to show you that we have this basically all over the site here. We got lots of radiocarbon dates here. This is a buried planting surface. We dated one of the maize kernels to the date that you can see here. Another storage pit. This is a unit on the other side of the hill here. This is the kind of this is a very interesting kind of pottery. Dave Overstreet believes that this is ancestral Menominee pottery. I believe him. I mean, he's the pottery expert here. Here you can see the size of one of these storage pits here. It's got a kind of a bell shape. This is a rodent burrow that's here. Again, we get lots of corn. We get squash, or excuse me, we get corn. We get nuts. We get wild rice out of these storage pits when they're basically not spoiled here. In another unit, here you can see the original surface of the ground. Here is the planting surface, excuse me, for that first field. Then you can see the deposition here, and then here is our second field. Here's another one of these sloping fields here. Now sometimes the ditches truncate the buried field, and sometimes they don't. And so we have a different way of constructing fields here than at Joe Dick East. At Joe Dick East, that original surface of the ground is always truncated by the ditches, right, through that second set of building that's down here. Here, sometimes it's truncated, sometimes it's not. Once they do that basket deposition, it's very gradual additions from the ditch deposits up, right? And so mounding up becomes something that's really important for the relief here. A different environment, a different way of constructing the fields, right? You have to be very much in tune to your environment here. Here you can see we've got a whole buried field here. Here's the deposition. Here is the planting surface. This was something I was not prepared for whatsoever. Supposedly, native peoples did not amend soils. Okay, supposedly. We're having a great deal of fun with these, with this particular site here. So we took these two units down at the same time, and as you can see, this field here is it's about 5 centimeters down. After we got the duff off, the organic O horizon off, we're about 5 centimeters down. You can see that this unit is dark. You can see in the nearby unit here, the adjacent unit. Again, here's the planting surfaces. You can see this light-colored deposit here. Here's a close-up of this light-colored deposit. This light-colored deposit is a prepared planting surface, and it's prepared with ash, it's prepared with charcoal, it's prepared with the wild rice chaff and other aquatics. Brought up, one basket load together, mixed together, laid out across the planting surface. Okay? When we initially got the wild rice chaff back, we didn't believe it because we're in the uplands, right? And you know we're supposed to be skeptical all the time, right? As we go through, we didn't believe it, so we sent it out to somebody else. Didn't tell them what it was at all, and they said, "Well, this is wild rice, right? You got this from the lowlands. The deposits are like this, and so we sent it out, right? This is not something that is simply being imagined. So we've had 3 different people look at this to make sure that this is what we're looking at. Why? Because we're always told that native peoples did not amend soils. Well, they did, and I don't think you need to be a soil scientist to see that there's a difference between this and this here, right? Which is pretty remarkable. For those of you that are interested in archaeology, this is a local imitation of the kind of pottery that we get down in St. Louis area of Illinois from a site called Cahokia, which suggests that native peoples were in contact with one another over long distances, exchanging ideas and probably trading and so forth here. So we look at areas on the site, but if you're going to understand, you also have to look at areas that weren't farmed. And in northeastern Wisconsin, when you have sandy acidic soils with forests that are dominated by conifers, we expect a kind of soil that's called a spottisol. And that's just soil that forms in those conditions, and it's got this big white layer that has a very prominent E horizon. Underneath it will be a very reddish-orange horizon that has a lot of iron and aluminum sesquioxides in it. I talked, before he passed away, I had long conversations with Francis Hole, who was a soil scientist who worked up on the Menominee Reservation. And he told me that he was always perplexed by the lack of spottisols, the lack of, especially an E horizon, in that particular environment. We did occasionally get E horizons, but they're not very well developed. So this is a control profile for Shepashticum. So this white layer here, this is a non-agricultural area. This is a natural soil. At Big Eddy West, which is one of our younger sites, we also got just a little paper-thin E horizon. All around Joe Dick, however, you won't find them. You won't find them at all. And one of the reasons for that, if you think about that stratigraphy, is you're going to have to change those soil-forming environment, right? So you're not changing the sand, right? Because sand is sand. You're not getting rid of the sand. You're changing the vegetation. And so if you think about that layer, right, that stratigraphic sequence, we have fields, then we have storage pits, a little bit of soil development, then we get fields, and then we get storage pits, right? And we take a look at the charcoal that's coming out of these sites. We're not getting the really old trees. We're getting things, for example, like hazelnut, right? So this is a food-producing kind of woody plant, early successional. Menominee peoples are managing the forest for centuries, right? Allowing the forest to come in at a young state, provide food, like with the hazelnuts, like with some of the other nut plants, and then after the soil has regenerated a little bit, then they clear the forest and bring back the agriculture. And so by interrupting, right, that old growth kind of conifer-dominated forest, they change the soil forming conditions. And so what we're seeing here is not just simply rotational agriculture, but a rotational agroforestry. This is very, very sophisticated stuff. You're providing food and you're increasing biodiversity at the same time. This is a way to produce food, right? It's just absolutely amazing. So these are the kinds of soils that we get around Joe Dick. And again, I don't think you need to be a soil scientist to see that there's a difference between this and this, right? This is the Big Eddy West site. This is a beautiful, beautiful site and absolutely the worst soil I've ever seen for agriculture. It's almost like concrete. I don't know how to farm this soil, but ancestral Menominee peoples basically did. We have a very complex field pattern here. There's a very, it's so nice when you're on the site because you can hear the Big Eddy Falls wherever you are. So when you're excavating, you've always got the waterfall there and all those wonderful sounds. It's really quite a magical place. It's a very high Pleistocene Ice Age stream terrace when all the big flood waters were coming down from the Langlade lobe farther north. Deposited a lot of cobbles and a lot of nutrient-poor deposits in this particular section of the Wolf River. Here we have a very different kind of burn. So here's a planting surface. This is one of these beautiful curvilinear fields. These field patterns are like sculpture almost. Each pattern is different, and there's an aesthetic here that's really something. But anyhow, this is a charred area here. Here's a close-up picture. Can you see how the deposits here are kind of a bluish color? This was burned very differently than the other sites. This was burned when the wood was still wet and when the ground was wet. And this was done on purpose. And the reason this was done is that if you have larger pieces of wood, which they have here, as opposed to the earlier burns, and you're burning it under reducing conditions so that the wood is only partially burned, okay, you create what we used to call pyrolyzed charcoal, but what's called biochar now in the tropics. And the microbes love this stuff, and it creates a very, 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 very fertile soil. It also sequesters carbon for those of you that are interested in climate change and those kinds of issues. So this is a very different kind of burn, and quite frankly, it's perfectly suited for this kind of conditions. We got radiocarbon dates here. This site dates to the early part of the 1600s. So this is just as Nicolet is making his landfall. A very different kind of environment. We're getting into what's called the Little Ice Age. So we're shifting from that warm, dry period that was earlier to, well, when George Washington is, freezing at Valley Forge, right? So this is a very different kind of environment. The Menominee peoples are still practicing agriculture. Yeah?
When you're saying wet wood, are you meaning green wood or just wet wood in general?
It could be either green or wet, and I don't have a way of discerning that at this particular time. But the important thing is that it's a fire in reducing conditions, and that the wood is incompletely burned, that there's some wood left in the center. And that combination of charcoal, actual char, it sets up an environment for the microbes, the kind of microbes that you want to create a fertile soil that is just basically unmatched. It's really remarkable stuff. In the tropics, especially in the Amazon, where this technique was first identified, it's now the use of biochar to improve tropical soils, degrade tropical soils is something that's really taking off. It's just a very old technique. It's something that was practiced in pre-Columbian times. Evidently, it was practiced by ancestral Menominee peoples as well. So, pretty sophisticated stuff here. We're still analyzing. That's what we do. We always put stuff in the lab and we analyze to make sure what's going on. But I feel pretty confident that this is biochar. And again, you don't have to be a soil scientist to see that the bluish-gray deposits here are very different than the reddish-orange ones that you saw earlier. Different kinds of burns for different kinds of environments. This is the Waycay site, and this dates to the time period of that lovely little assessment of Menominee agriculture that I started this particular lecture off with. There's an interesting kind of settlement pattern at this time. The Wolf River here seems to separate those bands that had converted to Christianity from those bands that, and I apologize for the language here, it's not Mayan, that are pagan here. What's interesting about the Waycay settlement is that it is a Thunder Clan settlement. From the traditions that have been shared with me, apparently it's the Thunder Clan that brought maize to the Menominee people. I was out here with some Thunder Clan members, one of whom still remembered his grandfather talking about the settlement here. It was really it was a very nice day in any event. The fields here are something that are very, very different than any place else. First of all, they're an order of magnitude larger than anything we had seen. Secondly, there's a plow zone, right, on the fields themselves. And so here's our sketch map. You can see the fields are oriented this way. Here's an actual plow zone. These fields are really, really quite large. What's happening here is, as part of those treaty rights, the federal government was supposed to provide experts, they were supposed to provide plows, they were supposed to provide oxen and so forth, so that Menominee peoples could practice agriculture. When the Thunder Clan received those items, it was still in the historic memory that what you do with them is not make a flat field, but what you do is you build raised fields. And this is not my language. It's called Boostrophoden relief, which means as the ox plows. And so they took that ox and they did these big, huge, kind of snaking back and forth, always angling the plow so that the deposits would make these huge raised fields, and then running the plow on the top. And I can only envision, because that's very different than what they were supposed to be doing, so I can only envision the conversation that was happening at that time. You're not doing this right, you're not doing this right, you know. But in any event, the practice was still within the historic memory of building raised fields at the time of the treaties. One of the great things about this project is, again, I can generate lots of numbers, but it's talking with elders and other people on the reservation where we can really have some really interesting conversations going back and forth. This is Soman Jim here, a Wabano, and this is a picture that was taken of his garden, kind of near the modern community of Zor. And we can learn a lot of things from the stories and from the pictures that are there. A couple of things to point out. You don't cut down every tree in the forest. You don't need to do that, right? Secondly, there's lots of different varieties of maize and squash and beans. It's not just simply putting them in, right? Any old variety. There's a very specific set of varieties of crops that are used in particular kinds of environments here. And so we've been able to put some of this together with what we find to try and get a more complete idea of the kinds of things that we can't dig up laughter, we can't dig up children playing, we can't dig up the sounds and the songs and things like that, right? But we can produce something, combine them with oral traditions, with historic documents, with what some people on the Menominee Reservation continue to do today to allow some more complete kind of understanding of this particular site. All right, survival gardens, lots of them. This is an unpublished survey here into the 1930s. Very, very quickly.
Next presentation is ready.
Okay, very, very quickly here. I generate lots of numbers in the lab. The long and short of it is this. When did you ever hear about a more fertile soil being created as the end result of agriculture? And that's what you have here. The red represents the raised fields, the blue represents our control profiles. We get higher levels of soil nutrients. We have a healthier soil as the end result of farming than we had at the beginning. That's a remarkable achievement, and we see that at site after site after site here. And this is the trick. I don't know what all is going on here. This is a sand grain. This is a picture of a soil beneath a planting surface. Here is some of that wild rice chaff. Here is, you can see that the brown here is very, very different. This is a very complex and very fertile soil that we're still working on trying to understand all the different components of here. You can see ash, these brightly colored crystals here are ash and so forth, and this is what we're working on right now to try and understand it. So to sum up, difficult to imagine a place more illy adapted or a people more incapable of agriculture? Oh, really? Well, ancestral Menominee peoples, the oldest raised fields in the mid-continent, soil amendments, rotational fallow agroforestry, biochar, continuous agriculture through periods of marked environmental change. It's my contention that we still have a lot to learn from the original sustainable and organic agriculturalists, and that agriculture is an important part of Menominee heritage. And with that, I will yield the floor after saying, I want to point out that Menominee kids did most of this work. This was not for a couple of years. Even when the program ended, they still came out and volunteered. We had all kinds of people come out. So I want to thank USDA NEFA program, because that's who funded this research, and I mostly want to thank Menominee Peoples, Wywenin, and I'm done. I'm out. Goodbye.
All right, the suggestion is going to be is that next year we give more